Lieutenant Marcus Webb navigated through the crowded market district of Syndra's Prime, with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been stationed on this alien world long enough to develop comfortable routines. 6 months as human military liaison meant he knew which routes through the commercial areas avoided the worst congestion, which vendors offered food compatible with human metabolism, and how to move through crowds of beings whose social customs he barely understood without causing diplomatic incidents. The posting was administrative tedium rather than the combat deployment his training had prepared him for, processing cargo manifests, coordinating security protocols, ensuring the small human presence on this predominantly Valtheran trade hub didn't create problems through cultural misunderstandings. Marcus had learned to be functionally invisible in public spaces, offering polite acknowledgement when accidentally making eye contact with strangers, but otherwise maintaining the anonymity that let him move through alien crowds without drawing unwanted attention. He passed a corner vendor stall where a Valtheran woman sat alone, wearing simple traveling clothes that marked her as someone of no particular importance. She was watching the crowd with careful attention, and for a fraction of a second, their eyes met as Marcus navigated past her table. He nodded politely, the generic acknowledgement he'd learned to offer, and continued on his way without a second thought, his mind already on the supply requisitions he needed to file before his shift ended. Just another person in a crowded market. Nothing remarkable, not worth remembering. What Marcus didn't know was that the unremarkable Valtheran woman he just passed without recognition was Kyrith Solmaris, the former queen of the Valtheran Dominion, believed dead for 3 years after a coup that supposedly killed her and installed a military junta ruling in her name. And for Kyrith, watching the human soldier pass by without a flicker of recognition or particular interest, that brief moment of being seen as completely ordinary felt like the first genuine breath she'd taken since losing her throne. Kyrith had been living in hiding since barely escaping the assassination attempt that destroyed her government. 3 years of survival by becoming exactly what the human had seen her as. An ordinary person, invisible in crowds, notable for nothing except her careful anonymity. She'd learned to make herself unremarkable, to avoid drawing attention, to move through the world as if she had no history beyond being another refugee displaced by Valtheran political instability. But even living anonymously, she was constantly aware that someone might recognize her, that despite the simple clothes and changed appearance, someone might see past her disguise. Most beings who looked at her carefully made her nervous. That scrutiny might lead to recognition, might trigger memory that she looked remarkably similar to the supposedly dead queen, whose face had once been broadcast across Valtheran space. When the human had looked at her, made brief eye contact, nodded politely, and moved on, his glance held no calculation, no assessment of whether she might be useful or dangerous or worth remembering. He'd seen her as what she appeared to be, an ordinary person, unremarkable, safe to ignore. For someone who'd spent 20 years being treated as symbol rather than person, who'd spent 3 years terrified of being recognized and murdered, that moment of being seen as completely ordinary felt like relief she hadn't known she needed. Over the following weeks, Kyrith noticed the human occasionally during her careful movements through Syndra's Prime's commercial districts. He followed predictable patterns, same routes, same vendors, same efficient way of navigating crowds. He never noticed her watching him, never showed any sign that he remembered their brief eye contact or considered her worth remembering. And that consistent failure to notice her became oddly comforting. He was a fixed point in her carefully anonymous existence, someone whose presence didn't threaten her hiding, whose indifference paradoxically made her feel safer than she had since losing everything. She learned his patterns without intending to, the times he typically passed through the market districts, the vendors he frequented, the routes he preferred. Not because she was following him exactly, but because their paths crossed often enough that she became aware of his routines the way you become aware of any consistent presence in your environment. And every time he passed her without recognition, without interest, without any indication that she was more notable than any other being in the crowd, Kyrith felt that same strange relief. The human soldier who didn't know she existed, who saw her as nobody important, had inadvertently become the most comforting presence in her carefully controlled exile. The situation that forced them into actual interaction came when remnants of Kyrith's former government, loyalists who'd been searching for any surviving members of the royal bloodline, finally tracked her to Syndra's prime. They weren't hostile. They were desperate refugees from the military junta's purges, looking for someone with legitimate claim to authority who might give them hope of eventual restoration. But their search created exactly the attention Kyrith had spent 3 years avoiding, drawing notice from the junta's intelligence networks who'd been monitoring for signs she'd survived. When the situation escalated into violence, junta operatives attempting to eliminate the loyalists and anyone they might have contacted, Marcus became involved because the fighting spread into areas where human civilians were present. His responsibility as military liaison was ensuring humans weren't caught in crossfire between factions whose conflict he didn't fully understand. He coordinated evacuations, established safe zones, and generally treated it as protect civilians rather than choosing sides in Valtheran politics. He encountered the Valtheran woman he vaguely remembered passing in the markets, now clearly trying to avoid armed pursuers who seemed specifically interested in her. Marcus's training said protect civilians from factional violence regardless of politics. So he did, providing cover for her escape, using his authority as human military personnel to create complications for pursuers who didn't want diplomatic incidents with the Federation. He treated it as protect the innocent rather than choosing sides in conflicts he wasn't qualified to judge. It was only after he'd gotten her to safety in the human diplomatic compound, where Valtheran factions couldn't easily reach her without creating diplomatic problems, that someone explained that the woman he'd just rescued was actually the supposedly dead queen of the Valtheran Dominion. That saving her had potentially significant implications for Valtheran politics, that his casual intervention had inadvertently positioned humanity as involved in succession conflicts. Marcus stared at the diplomatic officer delivering this information. "You're telling me the woman I just helped escape is the lost queen everyone thinks is dead?" "Yes, Queen Kyrith Solmaris, presumed killed 3 years ago in the military coup. Apparently, she's been hiding on Syndra's prime this entire time. And I just walked past her in the markets multiple times without recognizing her." Most people on this station wouldn't recognize her. Valtheran internal politics aren't widely followed by other species. But yes, you've apparently been passing the Lost Queen regularly for weeks without knowing it. Marcus processed this. "Does she know I had no idea who she was when I helped her?" "I assume so, though you should probably speak with her directly about that." Kyrith, for her part, found herself in the bizarre position of owing her life to the human who'd passed her weeks ago without a second glance. If Marcus had known who she was, he might have hesitated or calculated political implications before acting. But because he'd seen her as just another person who needed help, he'd responded with straightforward protective instinct that didn't pause to consider consequences. She'd survived because the one person who helped her hadn't recognized her importance. The immediate aftermath created complex situation where Kyrith was effectively under human protection. She couldn't safely leave the diplomatic compound while junta operatives actively hunted her. Her loyalists were scattered and vulnerable. Her options were extremely limited. Marcus became her primary contact not because he was qualified for managing exiled royalty, but because he was the one who'd brought her there, and because his straightforward competence impressed the diplomatic staff trying to figure out what to do with an unexpected queen. During days spent in close proximity while diplomats negotiated and strategists calculated, Kyrith and Marcus actually talked, not as queen and soldier, but as two people stuck in complicated situation neither fully chose. "I had no idea who you were when I helped you," Marcus admitted during one of their conversations. "I was just treating you like any civilian caught in violence. If I'd known the political implications, I probably would have handled it differently." "I know you didn't know," Kyrith responded. "That's precisely why your help mattered. If you'd recognized me as the lost queen, you would have been responding to symbol rather than person, making calculations about strategic value rather than just seeing someone who needed protection and providing it." She was quiet for a moment, then added, "Do you remember passing me in the market weeks ago near the spice vendors? You made brief eye contact, nodded politely, and moved on." Marcus searched his memory. "Vaguely, I pass a lot of people in the markets." "I know, that's what made it significant." Her voice carried emotion he couldn't quite identify. "You saw me as nobody important, just another being in a crowd, not worth particular notice. And that moment, that casual indifference to my existence, felt like the first genuine breath I'd taken in years." "I don't understand." Being queen meant never being allowed to be ordinary. Every interaction was calculated. Every glance assessed my power or how I might be useful. Losing my throne meant gaining anonymity I'd never experienced before. She met his eyes. "When you looked at me and saw nothing remarkable, when you moved on without a second thought, that felt like permission to exist as something other than my title." Marcus didn't fully understand why being ignored would mean so much, but he recognized the exhaustion in her voice. "So my complete failure to recognize you was actually helpful." "More than helpful. It was the first honest interaction I'd had in 3 years. You saw exactly what I appeared to be, an ordinary person, and treated me accordingly. No calculation, no assessment, no recognition that might lead to danger." She smiled slightly. "Then circumstances forced us together, and you helped me because you saw someone who needed help. Not because you knew I was valuable politically, but because protecting people is apparently just what you do." Their relationship developed from that foundation. Not romantic initially, just two people discovering that circumstances had connected them in ways that transcended official roles. Kyrith eventually decided to reclaim her throne, not because she particularly wanted to return to the burden of rule, but because the military junta had been destructive enough that she felt responsibility to restore legitimate governance. Marcus became part of that effort not because he had investment in Valtheran politics, but because he developed genuine care for the woman who'd been relieved. He didn't recognize her importance. The restoration succeeded. With human support and Kyrith's surviving loyalists, she reclaimed her throne, and the military junta was dismantled. But throughout the process, and in the years that followed, Kyrith maintained connection with Marcus built on the memory that he'd once seen her as nobody important, and that his indifference to her former status was the first genuine thing anyone had offered her in years. Years later, when historians documented the restoration of Queen Kyrith's reign, they focused on military and political aspects, strategic coordination, diplomatic maneuvering, complex negotiations. But Kyrith herself, when asked what made the restoration possible, pointed to a different moment. The day a human soldier passed her in a crowded market, made brief eye contact with someone he saw as completely ordinary, and moved on without a second thought. That moment of being unrecognized, of being seen as just another person in a crowd, had given her the first breath of relief she'd experienced since losing her throne. And when circumstances later forced them together, the relationship that developed was built on his continued ability to see her as a person first and a queen second. Because sometimes fate doesn't begin with recognition, but with the freedom to be ordinary. And sometimes the most important relationships start not with seeing someone's importance, but with the grace of seeing them as just another person